This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Susie Guerin. Brought to you in part by
TheStreet.com. Up-to-the-minute stock market news and in-depth analysis. Our quant rating service provides objective, independent ratings daily on over 4,300 stocks. Learn more at TheStreet.com/NBR.
Focus on Washington as a budget deal inches closer in D.C. Does the chance of a taper increase at the next week's Fed meeting? And what does all that mean for stocks?
Taking flight, the new American Airlines, the world's largest carrier, is now open for business. But is bigger really better for flyers?
And priced out, rents are rising and rising fast. But are the soaring prices creating an affordability crisis, one that this country has never seen before? We have all that and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Monday, December 9th.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tyler Matheson. Stocks eked out small gains on this slick and slippery Monday on Wall Street, and the treacherous weather wasn't the only reason shares had trouble getting traction. There was more of that taper talk today. That, in case you've been away for a while, is slang for discussion over whether and when the Federal Reserve might begin winding down its stimulus measures. Today, the chatter came from two Fed bank presidents. Dallas's Richard Fisher, long an opponent of aggressive stimulus, said the bond buying program should be curtailed, quote, at the earliest opportunity. Meanwhile, St. Louis's James Bullard said recent labor market strength boosts the case for tapering perhaps as soon as the Fed's meeting next week. Today's modest stock market gains, coupled with Friday's surge, suggest that the whole idea of tapering doesn't scare investors quite the way it once did. Here are the numbers from today. The Dow up 5 points, the Nasdaq gained 6, and the S&P added 3.
As Fed policymakers consider whether or not to taper, they're watching closely budget talks on Capitol Hill. The hope is that lawmakers make a deal before adjourning for the Christmas holiday and removing the fear of another government shutdown. John Harwood joins us now from Washington with more on all of this. So, John, when we were talking to you about this last week, you said lawmakers were close to a deal. Where do things stand now?
They're still talking. They hope to announce a deal tomorrow. But I got to tell you, Susie, it's kind of like what they say about academic politics. The smaller the stakes, the more intense the fighting. We're not talking about a big deal that hits the hot buttons of taxes and Medicare and Social Security. But you're hearing talk that the $90 billion deal they were talking about last week may be shrinking down as low as $60 billion. And it's unclear whether or not there's going to be any significant deficit reduction in the deal, or whether it's simply going to be reshuffling money from the sequester cuts, which members of both parties don't like, to cuts they like better.
Is the heart of this, John, doing away or somehow blunting the effects of those mandatory budget cuts under the sequester that I gather in different ways, in different programs, both parties would actually like to see happen?
Yes, that's the bulk of the deal, Tyler. It would lift the caps for defense spending, which a lot of Republicans, some Democrats also don't like. It would also lift the caps somewhat on domestic program. And again, they're mostly Democrats, but also some Republicans think those squeeze domestic spending too hard. The House couldn't pass their transportation bill this summer. So that's the motivation for the deal. But as you have a small stakes deal, members with particular constituent pressures under fire in that deal are resisting, like members from the Washington area who represent a lot of the federal employees whose retirement benefits would be affected.
Yeah, you know, John, a lot of businesses, a lot of CEOs are watching this very carefully because they always talk about uncertainty in Washington. And of course, people on Wall Street, investors, are hinging to, a lot hinges on this deal. When do you think that they expect to announce the outcome and vote on it?
A lot of members have gone to South Africa for the funeral services for Nelson Mandela, as the President of the United States has. So they wouldn't vote on the deal until at least Thursday. They do hope to announce it tomorrow so that they could then move through the legislative machinery toward a Thursday vote. But again, the longer disagreements go on, the more risk you have that it could be delayed slightly. I still would expect in the end they'll get it done this week.
All right, John Harwood reporting from Washington for us. John, thank you. A group of economists today forecast stronger growth next year. The National Association of Business Economists predicts the economy will grow at a pace of 2.8% in 2014. That's higher than earlier estimates. And they also say that we'll see job growth of about 200,000 a month in 2014.
Well, it's costing a little bit more to fill up the gas tank. Prices at the pump rose nearly 3 cents a gallon over the past 2 weeks. According to the Lundberg survey, the average price is now $3.28 a gallon nationwide. That's still 10 cents lower than it was a year ago.
Well, do you feel any wealthier these days? The Federal Reserve says you probably should. Household net worth hit a record high in the third quarter of this year, thanks to resurgent home values and that rising stock market. Add it all up, and U.S. households are now worth a total of more than $77 trillion.
But those soaring home values have caused a surge in the nation's rental market, and rental prices have risen dramatically. As Diana Olick reports, there's talk now that higher rents may have created the beginning of a rental bubble.
When millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure, they had no choice but to rent. And when the mortgage crisis curtailed credit for millions more potential home buyers, the rush to rent rose even more. And so did the rents.
We are in the midst of the worst rental affordability crisis that this country has known.
A new study released today in Washington by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing finds that half of all U.S. renters now pay more than 30% of their incomes on rent. That's up from 18% a decade ago. For those in the lowest income brackets, the jump is even worse.
Over 4 years, a 43% increase in the number of Americans with what we call worst case housing needs. Let's be clear what that means. They're paying more than half of every dollar they earn for housing.
Apartment rent growth accelerated over this past summer, now up 3% from a year ago, according to Reese, as vacancies continue to decline. The numbers are not lost on Annie Eccles. She's been renting for over 2 years, and the rent on her Bethesda, Maryland apartment has increased by the maximum allowable every year.
It's frustrating because we pay for rent, we also pay for parking, and just knowing that every June that's gonna increase significantly is frustrating.
And Annie pays almost as much each month in student loan debt as she does in rent. That makes saving for a down payment to buy a home more difficult.
You add in the fact that incomes for low and moderate income people have not been going up as fast as inflation. You have a situation where it's just going to be difficult for them to buy a home.
The good news is that construction on rental apartments has been ramping up, and the Obama administration is trying to entice more private capital back into the market. But with home ownership still out of reach for millions of Americans, rental demand is unlikely to ease anytime soon, nor are rising rents. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Diana Olick in Washington.
Uncle Sam is now officially out of the car business. The U.S. Treasury has sold the last batch of its shares of General Motors, closing out its 2009 bailout of the automaker. Taxpayers lost money on the deal. Treasury invested almost $50 billion to rescue GM and got all but $12 billion of it back.
Airbus is cutting thousands of jobs. The European aircraft maker, the main competitor to U.S.-based Boeing, announced it's cutting 5,800 jobs over the next 2 years, many from its space and defense divisions, as it looks to reduce costs.
Also making news in the aviation business, the merger of American Airlines and U.S. Airways has officially been completed, creating the world's largest carrier. The merged airline will take the American Airlines name. Shares of the new company rose nearly 3% in their first day of trading. Now, the new airline will feature 6,700 daily flights and a global network to rival giants like United Airlines and Delta. But will that be a good thing for travelers? Phil LeBeau has more.
In an industry where bigger is touted as being better, the new American Airlines is promising great service and competitive airfares now that it's merged with U.S. Airways to form the world's largest airline.
Nothing about this transaction is going to affect prices. As we've discussed in the past, we're putting these two airlines together. They're highly complementary.
With routes covering the world, American now has the size and network to compete with United and Delta. In fact, that trio of airlines, along with Southwest, will now fly almost 90% of the commercial flights in the U.S. Each has gone through a merger in recent years, raising concerns about whether bigger really is better for flyers.
In the absence of this particular merger, this combination, there wouldn't be anybody to challenge the Deltas and the Uniteds. Now, if you roll back the clock, you say United never happened and Delta never happened, so now you've got 6 instead of 3. there probably would have been some incremental service offered by the 6 that won't be offered by the 3.
The federal government tried to block the American-U.S. Air merger, saying it would hurt competition on certain routes. Eventually, it settled with American and forced the merged airline to give up a small percentage of its flights into major cities. This merger means that almost 100 million people will belong to the American Airlines frequent flyer program. Despite that enormous number, American says nothing will change with the program. Frequent flyers hope that's the case.
I think that American Airlines should be able to handle it, and they'll be fair and right about it.
I guess I'll have to wait and see. It's been good up until now, so I have no idea.
Phil LeBeau, Nightly Business Report, Dallas, Texas.
And still ahead, regulators are going to vote on one of the most contested elements of the post-crisis Wall Street Reform Act. How might the so-called Volcker Rule impact you, and will it protect the system from another meltdown? We'll discuss.
In a rare show of unity, 8 of the nation's biggest tech companies have teamed up. They're pushing for new limits on surveillance by the government. Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Yahoo, and AOL sent an open letter to the president and Congress calling for reforms and restrictions on how the government collects data on internet users. They also want government agencies to be more transparent about what they're looking for.
Well, some of those tech companies have seen their share prices soar this year, but not every company's been so fortunate. Seema Modi takes a look at some stocks that went to the dogs this year, but that some market pros say could turn into 2014 darlings.
Dogs to darlings, when some of the biggest losers one year turn into rising stars the next. It's a trend portfolio managers keep an eye on.
It is almost a Wall Street tradition, but not one lightly taken. And especially in a year where you've seen significant outperformance by many stocks.
It happened last year when Bank of America more than doubled, one of the top gainers in the S&P 500, a year after it lost 58%. Signs of a recovery in the housing market and better than expected earnings were good for bank stocks in 2012. On the other hand, Best Buy, Hewlett-Packard, Pitney Bowes, and Cliffs Natural were among the worst performing stocks on the S&P 500 in 2012. But Best Buy and Pitney Bowes became 2 of the darlings in 2013, up triple digits. Hewlett-Packard is also a winner, but Cliffs Natural continued barking, falling sharply this year. So who has a chance to go from dog to darling next year? Peabody Energy, Newmont Mining, Cliffs Natural Resources, and Teradata are on this year's list of worst performing stocks. When it comes to the miners, analysts are cautious, citing the volatility that we've seen in the price of precious metals like gold and silver. For Cliffs Natural, Hugh Johnson says it's all about the economy.
What really matters to this company is the economy has to do well. The economy is going to do a little better in 2014 and a little better in 2015.
For Peabody Energy, the bulls say the company did just come off a strong beat in earnings, but the bears are arguing that it came from cutting costs. Plus, coal demand in general is slower than usual. As for Teradata, a data warehousing firm, Morgan Stanley analyst cites concerns over its lack of growth overseas. The analysts overall seem to be a bit cautious about this year's dogs, wondering whether the economy will be strong enough to turn them into darlings in 2014. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Seema Modi.
Cisco will buy its rival U.S. Foods, creating a food distribution giant, and that's where we begin tonight's market focus. After the $3.5 billion deal is final, Cisco expects annual sales to grow to about $65 billion. The combined company will now have a quarter of the food distribution market in the U.S., and U.S. Foods will take a 13% stake in the new company. Shares of Cisco were trading at an all-time high today, up more than 9.5% to $37.62. Now, another food deal today. Packaged food company White Wave Foods is buying private earthbound farms for $600 million. It's part of a strategy to expand its organic offerings. White Wave is already the parent of organic dairy brands like Silk and Horizon Organics. The new purchase, Earthbound Farms, is the largest organic produce brand in North America. Shares of White Wave grew more than 5% to $22.92. McDonald's reported more sluggish sales in the month of November. Sales in the U.S. decreased as competition got tougher and traffic was flat. Global sales didn't change from October, which also disappointed investors. McDonald's shares down 1% to $95.72.
Covidien is buying medical diagnostics company Given Imaging. Given makes a remote imaging system that lets doctors diagnose stomach diseases with its ingestible pill cam, a wireless camera that sends back video of a patient's digestive tract. The $860 million purchase of the medtech company is 27% more than Given's Friday closing price. Shares of Covidien up a fraction, 68.13, the finish there on that news. Given soared 27% to $30.06. Well, just last week, we told you that an activist hedge fund was pressing Abercrombie & Fitch to search for a new CEO. It doesn't look like the teen retailer is taking the fund's advice. Abercrombie renewed its CEO's contract, which was set to expire in January. The chain did say, however, that it was tying its CEO's compensation more closely to the company's performance in this new agreement. The stock was off 2% to $34.10. And Mosaic will buy back about 10% of its outstanding stock, a $2 billion purchase from Cargill Trusts. The world's largest phosphate fertilizer maker said the move will wind down ties between Mosaic and Cargill. The transaction expected to be finalized over the next 8 months. Mosaic shares were down more than 1.5% today to $46.
And more trouble for the nation's largest bank. Now the U.S. government is investigating the hiring practices of J.P. Chase outside the United States. So far, federal authorities have unveiled emails that link the hiring of a top Chinese company official's son and efforts to win business deals with that government-owned company. And J.P. Morgan isn't alone. The Securities and Exchange Commission is also investigating similar deals at Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, among others.
Well, one of the most contested provisions of Wall Street Reforms Act is here. It's the so-called Volcker Rule, named after the former Fed chairman who inspired it. 5 years post-financial crisis, U.S. regulators are expected to vote tomorrow on a final version of the rule. It is the element of the Dodd-Frank reform law that is designed to keep some of the nation's biggest banks from trading for their own accounts. Many believe that such proprietary trading by FDIC-backed institutions could put taxpayers at risk if the trades melt down. Joining us now to discuss is Dick Beauvais. He is a vice president of equity research at Rafferty Capital. Dick, always good to see you. So, much discussion, Sturm und Drang, about this so-called Volcker Rule. But when you really cut to it, how many banks are likely to be affected by it, and how dramatically?
Well, it's going to affect a very tiny number of banks in the United States if it comes out the way we think it is. And you have to realize that they keep changing it. But if they just, were to put it into effect the way we think it is, then J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, to a lesser degree Bank of America, and Citigroup would be affected, and virtually all the other banks in the United States would not be affected. If, however, they choose to put something in there concerning hedging, then the top 100 banks in the United States would be affected, and they'd be affected pretty negatively.
So explain to us that aspect of hedging, because there has been a lot of complaints about that. How does that put these banks at a disadvantage?
Well, it doesn't put the banks at a disadvantage. It puts their customers at a disadvantage. It basically takes away from the customer the ability to lock in an interest rate or to lock in what the cost of a federal foreign exchange transaction would be. And therefore, it causes less activity in the banking industry, and it causes less trading. But remember, the person who gets impacted by this most is not the bank. It's the person who does business with the bank.
I was speaking last week with one top banker who said that we like to carry in our inventory lots of stocks, lots of bonds, because that's what our customers want. And they would say that, and this person said, that they need to hedge, that they need to trade to protect that large inventory. That's his point of view. Is it legit?
Well, I think it is. I mean, if you make the assumption that, for example, Fidelity wants to sell 1 million shares of IBM, and there's only natural buyers for 600,000 shares, then let's say Goldman Sachs has to buy the other 400,000 shares. If Goldman Sachs cannot hedge that 400,000 share position, it stands to lose a great deal of money or make a great deal of money. But by hedging, it can lock in what the potential gain or loss would be, and therefore they can allow that transaction to occur. Without hedging, the probability of letting that transaction occur at a reasonable price goes away. And therefore, the IBM sale occurs at a much lower price, which affects all prices of all people who are dealing in IBM stock.
Okay. You know, Dick, this Volcker Rule has been debated and criticized from banks to businesses and investors. Does it finally pass? And if so, what does this mean for the individual investor? Does it impact them at all?
Well, for the individual investors in the big companies that I just mentioned, it would have a negative impact. I feel pretty certain about that, because basically it will reduce overall trading in the United States markets. It will have a bigger effect on the average American, however, because if it goes into effect, the probability is that interest rates will be higher than they otherwise would have been. The cost of a loaf of bread will be higher. The cost of a gallon of gas will be higher. It will also result in a great deal of the trading, which makes the United States markets so liquid, will go to Singapore, to Shanghai. It will go overseas. So it'll do quite a bit of harm to the average
quickly,
American.
why is a loaf of bread going to go up because of the Volcker Rule? Very quickly.
Because the price of wheat will go up. In other words, if there's no liquidity in the market for wheat, then basically the price of wheat goes up. This bid and the offer in the wheat market spreads, causing higher prices for wheat, which causes higher prices for bread.
All right, Dick, thank you very much. Dick Beauvais, Vice President of Equity Research at Rafferty Capital.
And coming up on the program, why the new health law is creating an uneven playing field for hospitals and what some of them are doing about it. A new big worry for hospitals if the new rules in the Affordable Care Act mean sharp cuts in federal reimbursements for Medicare in the new year. Bertha Coombs explains.
What we're going to do today is assist you with going online and setting up your account and applying for the Affordable Care Act.
At Parkland Memorial Hospital, the push is on to get patients insured under Affordable Care Act plans.
When we open up at 7 o'clock, we typically open up with 50+ people coming in. With 10 employees, that already puts us about a couple of hours behind.
In 2012, Parkland provided $685 million in uncompensated care for its poor and underinsured patients. Yet under ACA, the hospital could still find itself in the red.
About a third of our revenue comes from the special payments. If we don't have those revenues, we can't fund the programs that they support.
Under ACA, federal payments to hospitals will be cut starting in 2014 on the expectation more patients will be insured. But Texas is among 24 states rejecting Medicaid expansion, which will provide free insurance for adults with little or no income who cannot afford to buy coverage.
By not expanding Medicaid, I estimate that is costing Parkland about $30 million a year starting next year.
In doctors' offices, the worry is that patients who buy low-cost ACA plans will face high out-of-pocket costs for things like lab tests.
Once you get their preventive care, if there's an abnormal lab, an abnormal finding, what is the follow-up? Is it going to be covered by that insurance company?
Another worry, the most affordable plans have narrow networks, which could exclude doctors patients already see at low-income clinics like this one.
Well, if patients are drawn to plans that we're not in, then what we're doing is we're pursuing those plans ourselves. So we are trying to get enrolled into those networks so that we'll be able to take care of the patients. This is a unique moment where we haven't had to think that way before.
A Commonwealth Fund study estimates that by 2022, taxpayers and providers in states that reject Medicaid expansion will lose out on billions in federal funding. It will cost Texas $9.2 billion that year, while Florida, which also has some of the highest rates of uninsured patients, would see a net loss of $5 billion.
Hospitals in states with Medicaid expansion have yet another advantage over facilities like Parkland and others in states that don't expand. If a patient shows up and is uninsured but otherwise eligible, they can sign them up for temporary Medicaid expansion coverage and get reimbursed.
It would be enormously better if we were part of Medicaid expansion. It makes perfect sense from almost any way you look at it.
Providers expect those states will expand eventually. Until then, they'll try to enroll as many patients as they can. Bertha Coombs, Nightly Business Report, Dallas.
And to read more about Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas and what it's doing to get patients insured, go to our website, nbr.com.
And finally tonight, AMC Entertainment, which is planning on going public, has found a unique way to reward some of its best customers. It's setting aside some of its IPO shares just for movie lovers. The big theater chain is making a tiny part of its $368 million IPO available for its AMC Stubs loyalty program members. Frequent moviegoers who pay a small fee to the company every year for perks like skipping online ticket fees and getting a break at the concession stand. Now they'll get a little bit, maybe, of the stock.
Get your soda, get your popcorn, get your
and get a share.
That's Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Susie Garib. Thanks so much for joining us.
And thanks from me as well. Have a great evening, everybody. We hope to see you back here tomorrow night.
Nightly Business Report has been brought to you in part by
TheStreet.com. Up-to-the-minute stock market news and in-depth analysis. Our quant rating service provides objective, independent ratings daily on over 4,300 stocks. Learn more at TheStreet.com/NBR.
I'm Susie Garib with a Nightly Business Report news brief. 1 week ahead of the Federal Reserve's next policy meeting, more taper talk today. Two top Fed officials say winding down the central bank stimulus plans could be soon. On Wall Street, the whole idea of tapering doesn't sound as scary to investors as it once did. The Dow rose 5 points, the Nasdaq gained 6, and the S&P added 3 points. The Treasury sold the last remaining shares it held in General Motors after bailing out the automaker back in 2009. Uncle Sam lost $12 billion on that deal. And do you feel any wealthier? The Federal Reserve says household net worth hit a record high this year thanks to higher home values and the surging stock market. Be sure to tune into Nightly Business Report right here on your public television station.